Get the feel of wholesome refreshment with an ice-cold bottle of Coca-Cola, and you'll really feel better.
Coca-Cola, one of the most ubiquitous and recognizable brands in the world. It's therefore perhaps unsurprising that it's also one of the best examples of a ruthless and immoral corporation. It claims to be green while ranking as the #1 plastic polluter worldwide. It drains water resources in drought-ridden communities. It spends hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying to convince people that sugar water isn't bad for you. Not to mention the death squads murdering union leaders. All of these things will be covered in part 2, but I think it's important to stress that Coca-Cola did not grow into a shady company. It was born a shady company. Dark side of the moon shady. To understand how Coca-Cola became what it is now, it's useful to look back at its earlier years. Snake oil swindlers, con men, Nazi collaborators, addiction, fraud, greed, political influence. This is the story of Coca-Cola.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with
Burns your tummy, don't you know? Chug-a-lug, chug-a-lug.
The story really begins in 1863, when a French chemist named Angelo Mariani created a drink combining wine and cocaine with a little bit of brandy and sugar, called Vin Mariani. Presumably you'd have to supply your own cigar. Combining cocaine with alcohol produces a substance called coca-ethylene, which creates a stronger euphoric effect than either drug alone. Vin Mariani was marketed as a medicinal cure-all for both children and adults, treating everything from pain to influenza to malaria. It was exceptionally popular among the moneyed classes, enjoyed by the likes of Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle, Alexander Dumas, Thomas Edison, and US President Ulysses S. Grant. Pope Leo XIII loved it so much that he carried a flask at all times for when prayer was insufficient. He gave Mariani permission to use his image in advertising, in addition to creating a Vatican gold medal specifically for awarding it to Mariani. 2 years after the creation of Vin Mariani in 1865, an American pharmacist and lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army named John Stith Pemberton was wounded by a saber to the chest at the Battle of Columbus. Like many Civil War veterans, he became addicted to morphine and tried various painkillers in an attempt to relieve his dependency, including Vin Mariani. But the drink wasn't widely popular in the United States because its cocaine content was lower than what Americans generally preferred. So around 1885, he took it upon himself to make his own version called Pemberton's French Wine Coca, which was basically the same thing, but with more coca and the addition of African cola nuts, which contain caffeine. He sold the drink to his local pharmacy in Fulton County, Georgia, as a patent medicine, where it was marketed as a cure-all for treating headaches, mental exertion, fatigue, impotence, and conditions like neurasthenia, a popular nonsense diagnosis among the southern upper class, characterized by anxiety, lethargy, irritability, and depressed mood. Feeling a bit down in the dumps? Just have some of my cocaine wine. It has cola nuts in it. Like most patent medicines at the time, it was pure snake oil. Whatever ailed you, Pemberton's French Wine Coca could cure it. But in 1886, Fulton County banned alcohol, and Pemberton set about making an alcohol-free version. His new drink contained a mix of coca leaves, sugar, and cola nuts in a thick syrup to be mixed with carbonated water at soda fountains, which were a staple of pharmacies at the time, because it was believed that carbonated water cured illness.
The top panel is a lighted sign for even greater selling impact.
Supposedly, Pemberton's bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, came up with the name Coca-Cola and designed its logo. The two of them gathered some business partners and investors and established the Pemberton Chemical Company to market and sell Coca-Cola. But the drink was far from revolutionary. Dr. Pepper was created 1 year earlier. Moxie Soda and Heinz Root Beer had been on the market for 10 years, and Werner's Ginger Ale for 20. More importantly, just 1 year before making Coca-Cola, there was a Spanish drink called Cola Coca, made from coca leaves and cola nuts, which was presented at a convention in Philadelphia, where it won the top prize for innovation. Pemberton just so happened to own a pharmaceutical manufacturing business in Philadelphia at the same time. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but Cola Coca, Coca-Cola, they both have the same ingredients. Anyway, Coca-Cola didn't sell very well, around 3,000 glasses at 5 cents each in Atlanta in the first year. When Prohibition in Fulton County was repealed in 1887, Pemberton returned his focus to making his more popular French wine Coca. 1 year later, in 1888, he was very ill, and his morphine addiction was the worst and most expensive it had ever been. He worried about going bankrupt and started selling off parts of his businesses. But he kept it secret from his partners at Pemberton Chemical Company, who also owned those businesses. In a series of bizarre secret transactions, he sold 2/3 of the rights to Coca-Cola to two men named Venable and Lowndes, who paid him $1,201. But $1,200 of that was actually an interest-free loan to be paid back by Pemberton from his 1/3 share of future profits. Lowndes was an old friend from boarding school, and according to him, Pemberton urged him to buy the rights, insisting it would one day be a success, but that he wanted to keep 1/3 of it for his son, Charles, so he would always have an income. Pemberton told his nephew, around the same time, that if he could only get $25,000 in capital, he would spend $24,000 on it on advertising, and the rest on manufacturing Coca-Cola, and then we would all be rich. When his partners at Pemberton Chemical Company got wind of what he was doing, they accused him of engaging in a conspiracy and took him to court. A judge granted a temporary restraining order, but for some reason the matter never went to trial. In short, Pemberton was a duplicitous operator who screwed over his own business partners, and the rights to Coca-Cola were sliced into little, hotly contested pieces. During the legal trouble surrounding all of this, he consulted with an attorney named John Candler, who then introduced Pemberton to his older brother, Asa Candler, a businessman in Atlanta who ended up acquiring all the little pieces of the rights to Coca-Cola from Pemberton and various others over several years. A short time after meeting Candler, Pemberton died of stomach cancer at the age of 57. His only son, Charles, who was also an addict, was involved with Candler and Coca-Cola for a time, but through a series of complicated legal shenanigans was eventually ousted. 6 years after the death of his father, Charles was found unconscious with heroin at his side, and was taken to a hospital where he died in what was determined to be a suicide. There were a lot of accusations against Candler regarding his dubious acquisition of Coca-Cola. A woman named Margaret Dozier would later take him to court, saying that she never sold her share of the rights and that her signature had been forged. 2 handwriting experts agreed with her. She believed that her brother may have forged her signature before mysteriously disappearing without a trace, and that Candler had a hand in it. On another contract, written by Candler, one of Pemberton's signatures was determined to be a forgery as well, and not a very good one at that, according to an expert. Around the same time, Candler told his brother that he was exerting a little influence to acquire full control over Coca-Cola. Pemberton's sister-in-law believed that Pemberton's wife had forged his signature after his death, because Candler promised that he would pay her a share of the profits later, but he never did. Pemberton's niece confirmed this story, saying that she overheard the conversation between Candler and Mrs. Pemberton. Other family members believe that Charles may have forged the signature while drunk for a pittance that he spent on alcohol. The stories are varied, but the entire family agreed that there was something suspicious about the sale and the clearly forged signature. Whatever the truth is, Asa Candler ended up being the sole proprietor of Coca-Cola. His obituary and Coca-Cola PR materials depict him as having a sort of rags to riches story, fueled by entrepreneurial spirit. But his prominent family background and political connections suggest otherwise. Asa's father, Samuel C. Candler, was a wealthy speculative landowner who owned 36 slaves before the Civil War and had been a member of both houses of the state legislature. His immediate family members included a bishop in the Methodist Church and university president, a Georgia comptroller general, an associate justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, a Mississippi state congressman, a United States congressman, a businessman in banking and merchandising, and a governor of Georgia. It's true that his family wasn't quite as wealthy as they were when they owned slaves, but they weren't destitute, and they were deeply connected in both business and politics across multiple generations. Asa himself grew up wanting to be a physician, studying under private tutors before moving to Atlanta and starting a wholesale pharmaceutical company. After acquiring all the rights to Coca-Cola, he sold his lucrative drug business and founded the Coca-Cola Company. Like many stories of this sort, he's been framed as a marketing genius, meaning he spent a lot of money on advertising.
The merchandising umph, simple yet forceful in its selling impact.
In 1889, his first year of owning Coca-Cola, he spent $11,000 on advertising, around $350,000 in today's money. He bought a full-page ad in the Atlanta Journal, printed thousands of coupons for a free glass of the drink, shipped gallons of free syrup to prominent family members around the country for distribution to their local soda fountains, and began a massive branding campaign. Signs, clocks, pencils, calendars, plates, napkins, trays, posters, bookmarks, chandeliers, soda dispensers, all branded with the Coca-Cola logo. Paid celebrity endorsements would soon follow, beginning with stage actress Hilda Clark in 1900, followed by opera singer Lillian Nordica in 1905, and several prominent baseball players shortly after that. And here, just maybe, is a new, modern ad that doesn't rely on famous people or treating its audience with contempt. Ha ha! Not bloody likely. Liberty, liberty. Within 10 years, Coca-Cola was sold in every state of the US. Sales tripled. A new corporate headquarters was built 5 separate times, a bigger and better one about every 2 years, and multiple syrup manufacturing plants were constructed around the company. Most importantly, bottling operations began. This, again, wasn't revolutionary. By the time Coca-Cola came to market, there were already thousands of soda bottling companies in America. What was important was the strategy used. Independent companies would buy the syrup from Coca-Cola, mixing it with carbonated water from their own local water sources and bottling it in their own factories. This would become more and more critical for the company as time went on. By selling only the syrup, Coca-Cola wouldn't have to worry about securing large sources of clean water themselves, and shipping costs were much cheaper. Eventually, the company would start buying partial ownership stakes in bottlers, between 15 and 30%, so they could have a say in the operations. After all, without Coca-Cola syrup, there would be no product. But on paper, the company wouldn't necessarily be responsible for the action of the bottlers. This would become really, really important in later years. Anyway, bottling quickly expanded internationally, starting with Canada, Cuba, and Panama in 1906. For the Coca-Cola Company, what really mattered in terms of their own investment was marketing and brand recognition, making the name as ubiquitous as possible. That ubiquity, I would argue, was and is the most critical component to Coca-Cola's enduring success. By 1902, the company was spending about $100,000 a year on marketing, over $3 million in today's money, making it one of the biggest ad spenders in the country. And Asa Candler, for his most likely fraudulent acquisition of Coca-Cola, became astronomically wealthy, allowing him to heavily invest in real estate and banking, and become yet even more wealthy. He started his own bank, the Central Bank and Trust Company, in Atlanta. It was located next to Coca-Cola's headquarters in the Candler Building, the tallest structure in Atlanta at the time, which he also owned. He created the wealthy Druid Hills neighborhood, where Atlanta's most extravagant mansions were built, including his own and those of his children. He gave money to Emory University, where his brother Warren was president, and the School of Theology was subsequently named after him. As in the cases of other ruthless wealth seekers, philanthropy was key to shaping the public perception of him. In 1917, he became mayor of Atlanta. Parks and buildings and an airport were named after him. At the end of his term in 1919, he gave most of his stock in Coca-Cola to his children, who in turn sold it to a group of investors for $25 million, which today would be about $500 million. In total, Candler was worth more than $1 billion in today's money when he died of a stroke in 1929. His children went on to be wealthy socialites, with little involvement in the company, doing things like building private zoos at their mansions. I think this early history of the advent of Coca-Cola and its acquisition by Candler is an apt symbol of what was to later come. Deception, acquisition, political influence, plausible deniability. Money and power creating money and power. This would be mirrored in Coca-Cola's history for the next 140 years, which have been rife with controversies, some better known than others. Early on, there was controversy around the cocaine content of Coke, not because it's bad for you, but because of racism. Between 1898 and 1914, there was an increasing public perception that cocaine was fueling a wave of black violence against white people, especially white women in the South. Just accusing a black man of using cocaine was enough sometimes to justify lynchings. There were congressional hearings where experts testified that the drug made black men in particular uniquely violent, because their brains are different, you see, and also better at using guns. Yes, really. The drug wouldn't be banned for another 7 decades, but due to the public hysteria, in 1903, Coca-Cola began extracting the cocaine from coca leaves before adding them to the drink. The leftover extract, the good stuff, was then sold to pharmaceutical companies. To make up for the lack of cocaine, they added more caffeine, about 78 milligrams per 8 ounces, a little less than a cup of coffee. This led to Coca-Cola's first federal lawsuit in 1906, when Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. In the lawsuit, United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, the government contended that Coca-Cola was adulterated by a poisonous or deleterious substance, caffeine, that might render it dangerous to human health. In addition, they accused Coke of misbranding because it contained no coca and very little cola, even though the label showed images of coca leaves and cola nuts. Coca-Cola won the case, but the government appealed, took it to the Supreme Court, and won. Coca-Cola ended up reducing the caffeine content and paying the government's legal fees as part of a settlement. For a while after this, everything was gravy. Coke continued to get bigger and bigger, spreading all over the globe. In the 1920s, they added radio sponsorships to their growing advertising repertoire, and the famous Santa Claus campaign began in 1931. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, Coca-Cola's German bottling subsidiary was 4 years old and selling about 100,000 cases every year. Pretty good, but not great. To the Germans, it was seen as a sweet drink for children and was unpopular among adults who preferred beer. But then, a German businessman named Max Kite came to work for the company and was quickly put in charge of the entire German operation by the US-based president of the Coca-Cola Company, Robert Woodruff. Kite brought Coca-Cola to new heights of popularity in Germany by collaborating with the Nazi regime. He took the same motifs used in American advertisements for Coke, patriotism, purity, and can-do spirit, and repurposed them for the Third Reich, in addition to sponsoring high-visibility events.
So Tilly Fleischer gets a gold medal and becomes Germany's first Olympic champion of 1936.
In 1936, they sponsored the Berlin Summer Olympics, supplying bottles for athletes and visitors, and creating banners featuring the Coca-Cola logo next to the swastika. Robert Woodruff, the US president of Coke, was a special guest at the Games. Later that year, in September, Hermann Goering announced plans to create a self-sufficient Germany, heavily restricting imports from foreign countries. Robert Woodruff took steps to protect the company's profits in Germany by petitioning Goering to allow Coca-Cola to keep supplying syrup to its subsidiaries. Kite considered smuggling the syrup into the country, but settled on trying to produce it domestically to make up for the reduced supplies. In the meantime, he continued sponsoring Nazi events. Coca-Cola trucks were sent to Hitler Youth rallies. A working Coke bottling plant was set up at a 1937 exhibition for Nazi industry, where company photographers took a picture of Goering drinking a bottle of Coke, according to the book For God, Country and Coca-Cola by Mark Pendergrast. If this photo still exists, it's nowhere to be found. In March 1938, after Hitler annexed Austria, Kite held a convention for Coke Germany's salesmen and Bottlers, featuring a massive picture of Hitler and a Coca-Cola banner with swastikas, and Kite called for attendees to Sieg Heil in honor of the Führer, who was purportedly a fan of Coke. Again, there are no available pictures of this, as there has been a great effort to sanitize this particular part of Coca-Cola's history. It's not just formula in the Coca-Cola vault. Once Germany had captured France and was preparing to invade Britain, Kite worried that Coke Germany would be nationalized and that import restrictions would worsen. Using his connections with the Third Reich, he became supervisor of all soda plants in Germany and the occupied territories, and started working on a new drink that could be manufactured entirely in Germany using industrial byproducts like whey and leftovers from apple processing. This new drink was called Fanta.
Entwickelten Sie einfach ein neues Getränk. Tata, die Geburtsstunde der Fanta.
When Germany entered the war in 1941, communications between the Coca-Cola Company and Coke Germany ceased. Using his connections yet again, Kite was able to circumvent sugar restrictions in Germany, so Fanta tasted sweeter than rival drinks, and it became the #1 Nazi soda, selling over 3 million cases per year. Meanwhile, back in the US, Coca-Cola was making bottles with Hebrew inscriptions denoting that the drink was kosher. Once the war was over, Coke Germany and Coke America were reunited, and Kite handed all of the profits from Fanta to Coke America. In return, Woodruff put him in charge of the entirety of the company's operations in Europe, and Coca-Cola kind of just pretended that none of this had ever happened. Until, sort of, 2015, when they released a special 75th anniversary edition of Fanta in Germany, featuring the original formula in the original bottle, and they put on a commercial about the creation of Fanta and bringing back the feeling of the good old times. The ad was pulled after immediate backlash, and a Coke spokesperson put out a statement saying that Fanta was invented in Germany during the Second World War, but the 75-year-old brand had no association with Hitler or the Nazi Party. This is a lie. Fanta was specifically created for Nazi Germany after it declared war on the USA, because Coca-Cola syrup could no longer be imported at all. When it had been restricted, but not totally cut off before then, Kite saved the last of his syrup reserves for Nazi officers. In fact, I think there's a strong argument that Fanta would not have been at all successful without close collaboration between Coca-Cola Germany and the Nazi Party. But that wasn't the last time that Coke was involved with authoritarianism. The company began selling in South Africa in 1938, 10 years before the institution of apartheid, which they supported as their empire continued to grow. But before we get there, in the 1940s, they made a special variation of Coke for Georgy Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, who apparently loved it after drinking it during a meeting with Dwight D. Eisenhower. But Coca-Cola was banned in the Soviet Union, and Zhukov didn't want to be seen drinking a product of American imperialism. So he contacted the commander of the American forces in the Allied-occupied sector of Austria, General Mark W. Clark, about getting some special-made Coke in secret. Clark contacted President Truman, who contacted the chairman of the board of the Coca-Cola Export Corporation with Zhukov's request. So Coke made a special version called White Coke, which had the same flavour but was clear in colour and came in a bottle that resembled a vodka bottle, complete with a red star on the cap. The first shipment to Zhukov contained 50 cases and received special priority when crossing into the Soviet occupation zone, avoiding inspections. Anyway, despite collaborating with the Nazis, things went swimmingly for Coke after the war. The first television ads aired in the 1950s, and in the 60s they acquired new brands like Minute Maid juice and launched new sodas like Sprite. Plastic bottles were introduced in the late 70s, and as the 80s approached, advertising soared to over 180 million and profits crossed to over $1 billion per year. But in 1977, just 6 years after Coke's famously inclusive and saccharine "I'd like to buy the world a Coke" commercial, an African-American preacher and member of the board of directors of General Motors, named Leon Sullivan, drafted a corporate code of conduct called the Sullivan Principles, which urged corporations to treat employees equally, regardless of race, and avoid involvement with segregation. It was a direct attack on South African apartheid and a call for other companies to divest from the country. Coca-Cola refused to participate, and in 1978, the US Senate's Foreign Relations Subcommittee formally wagged its finger at the company for its continued involvement with apartheid South Africa. Oh no! By the 1980s, Coke was doing sales of $260 million per year in South Africa. It was one of the biggest US employers in the country, with 4,500 employees at a syrup manufacturing plant and a 30% ownership stake in a major bottler, operating with racially segregated housing, job sites, and wages. In 1981, civil rights activists brought attention to Coke's support of apartheid, and college students across the US boycotted the company. Several colleges announced they would become Coke-free campuses, and protests were staged at the company headquarters in Atlanta. Coca-Cola initially responded by promising to promote more African Americans in the United States and to review how to deal with South African apartheid. Finally, in 1986, they announced that they would be divesting from South Africa. However, they did so in a unique way. They sold their 30% share of the bottling company and moved their syrup manufacturing plant to the neighbouring kingdom of Swaziland, where King Mswati offered them special legal protections, a special low tax rate of 6%, and an abundance of cheap labour. So they technically no longer owned assets in South Africa, but their primary business had always been selling syrup to bottlers, which they kept doing, and South Africa remained their number one customer on the continent. They divested from South Africa, but they never stopped profiting from it. For good measure, they gave $10 million to a South African charity and started celebrating themselves as helping to end apartheid. But there were other problems with Coke brewing in Africa, and indeed the rest of the world. By the 1980s, the company was massive, earning more than $1 billion per year, with soda consumption, especially in America, increasing more and more. But it takes a lot of water to make Coke, about 70 litres for 1 litre of the finished product. As well as consumption, public awareness about plastic litter, pollution, labour issues, and the health effects of soda were increasing too. A new era of public messaging and political influence was on the horizon. And that's what I'll be talking about in part 2. Water, pollution, public health trickery, and of course, and I wish I was kidding, Coca-Cola death squads. So, see you then. Marshal Zhukov, that's not Coca-Cola, is it?
Нет, it's vodka.
Oh, Good. Yeah, I just drink 4 or 5 bottles a day.